Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome back again to this hybrid model. Again, everyone is invited, please, to resume live also, so that we can get the live sharing going. I wanted to use this week actually to look at something which I think is an important topic, often discussed but not really fully understood, and something that I think offers insight into some important matters. And this actually continues something I mentioned last week. Last week I began discussing the concept of a bris, a covenant, and what a covenant means, and how we're meant to understand it. And I got quite a lot of questioning around that and interesting comments afterwards. So I thought I'd use this opportunity to explore again the idea of a covenant in a completely different manner and different context. And to ask the question, really, one way I posed the question, I put this as the title of the shiur, is were the Avos Jewish? Were the Avot Jewish? Were they Jewish or not? Another way one could have posed this question is who is a Jew, or what is a Jew? What do we mean when we say someone is Jewish? Obviously, in different contexts, we could give multiple answers to this question. As Jews, are we an ethnic identity? Are we a culture? Are we a race? Are we a people? Are we a religion? Lots of different ways of understanding what we mean by the concept of a Jew. And probably our answers would be somewhat affected by our hashkafa, by different Jews, perhaps with different sorts of answers. But even in the halachic realm, it's not entirely clear how to answer that question. Perhaps we can answer the halachic question of what makes someone a Jew, whether it's descent, matrilineal descent, whether it's conversion. But it seems to sort of somewhat miss the point nonetheless. That's how one perhaps technically is a Jew or halachic. It becomes one, but what do we really mean when we say someone is Jewish? Do we mean we're members of a particular people or a particular race, or what exactly is the concept? And I think this is appropriate to explore in these weeks, in the sedras of this week, in the Parshas of this week. From Lech Lecha and on, we've really been telling the story of the founding parents, the Avos and Umos, the founding parents of the Jewish people. And we're sort of trying to look what they did, what they achieved. What do we mean when we say they founded the Jewish people? What did they find? And what were they themselves? And what do we really mean by this question? Were they Jewish? Part of the problem when we ask this question is it's not clear what exactly we mean by that term Jewish and how to apply it. Perhaps just as an aside, I printed here some little pictures because if we're speaking about this topic, just something I find very moving. If we're speaking about the founding of our people, I've printed here the first written record in history outside Tanakh itself, or the first image rather that we have of Jews. And this is the famous black obelisk of Charminettes III, which you can see actually it's about 7 foot tall, so it's slightly taller than a person. It's about 2 foot thick. It's got 4 sides, and on each side there are 5 panels. It was found in 1840s, 1846, and you can actually see it. I've been seeing it. You can see it in the British Museum, and it's been dated to about 850 BC. So we're talking about close to 3,000 years ago. And the secular figure, the external figure referenced is Charminettes III. And the Jewish figure here that's spoken about in this panel is someone called Yehu, who, if you remember your Malachim base, chapters 8 and 9, you'll remember that he was the usurper usurped the position of Achav. Achav himself was anointed, he was appointed by Elisha. The kingdom had already split into Yehuda and Yisrael, and he usurped Achav, the king of the breakaway, one half of the provinces of the Jewish people, and he was the Melech. And this panel, which we can now decode to some degree, describes tributes, and it shows us an image of Jews. You can see in the diagram, I hope you can see the figure bowing down. That's a Jewish man. And if you look with care at the picture, he looks quite Jewish. He's wearing a hat. He's got a beard. But this is the embassy of Yehu, the message of them. By the way, if you look, there's little tassels coming out of his belt. It's not clear what these tassels are. There are a minority of scholars who think these might be tzitzis even that we're actually looking at. I think it's interesting that the first picture or image we have of a Jew is unfortunately someone subjugated. He's groveling on the ground. And I find that very moving that the most ancient picture we have of a Jew is found in this position of needing to bow down to a more powerful authority. So perhaps in a non-serious way, but also making a serious point. Perhaps if you ask what's the key feature of being a Jew, perhaps one aspect of this sadly is answered by this image. But obviously we do need to ask this question: what do you mean by a Jew? I'm not going to go now into the question of what the chosen people and is ascribing specialness to ourselves a racist concept is another interesting discussion, other than to say that obviously from our perspective, we don't see it that way. It's open to anyone. Anyone can choose to join our people, the concept of Gerus. We see ourselves more as a people or a nation than a race anyway. And we're not ashamed to say that to be a Jew is to have responsibilities and a mission. That's what it means to be a Jew. But what else can we say about this? And what key sources do we have around this? So maybe going actually to source 2, skipping out source 1 for a moment. One answer we may be tempted to give is that a Jew is someone who keeps the Torah, someone who has who keeps the Torah. And there are indications in Chazal that seem to suggest that Avram and perhaps all the others, not entirely clear, kept the whole Torah. And this is in source 2, a Mishnah in Kedushin, which says that we have a source that Avram kept the whole Torah. Motzinu she also Avram Avinu's kol Torah kula. Ad shelo nitna. Avram kept the whole Torah before it was given. Shnei me'ikav asher shama Avram b'kodi v'yishma nishvati mitzvosach v'kosach v'terasni. Avram kept my commandments, my statutes, and my Torah. So this source seems to say that Avram kept the Torah. There's a lot that's unclear about this Mishnah. Does this Mishnah mean to say that literally Avram kept the Torah as we currently know it? Chazal speak about Avram even keeping mitzvahs drabanan. Does it mean he literally kept the Torah? Does it mean he kept mitzvahs which seem to be contingent based upon circumstances at the time? Yitzias Mitzrayim, so to eat matzah and maror on Seder night. There are different approaches to this. There's approaches that we're meant to understand this Chazal literally, and that there's some sort of intrinsic quality to matzah and maror and the like that makes sense as a symbol, perhaps of the concepts of freedom and slavery, even pre the Shibud Mitzrayim, or perhaps it means the values of the Torah, the concepts behind the Torah. The source isn't entirely clear. It's also not entirely clear whether it's only Avram or all the others. I mean, we do find that, for example, Yaakov, who is of course born in this week's Sedra, marries 2 sisters, Rachel and Leah, which in the Torah is forbidden. So even if they kept the Torah, seems to have been something they kept it perhaps on a voluntary basis, sometimes chose not to keep it, or the Ramban suggests that they didn't keep it in the Kotzvaret. Either way, keeping of the Torah is not going to be the answer to our question over here. It's possible that they kept some form of proto-Torah, or kept the Torah in some form or other, or brought into the values of the Torah, and nonetheless, this isn't what we mean by, in and of in itself, being Jewish. There are also Chazals that use sort of halachic language of Jewish identity. And again, it's not clear if they mean this in a sort of technical halachic sense, or they just mean it as a concept or trying to bring out a point. And in source 1, I just very briefly quoted that when Lech Lecha, when Avram at the time is told at the beginning of Lech Lecha to leave his country and move to the land that I will show you, eventually to the land of Canaan, to Eretz Israel. It says in Pasuk 5, in Pasuk K, Vayikach Avram es Sarai Ishtoi, Avram took his wife, there's Lot ben Achiv, there's Kol Chusham, Asher Achshu, there's HaNefesh, Asher Osu B'choron. The souls that they had made or created, Asher Osu B'choron. HaNefesh, Asher Osu B'choron, the souls they made in Choron. So who are these souls that were made in Choron? So Targum Yonason, which is a translation ascribed to Yonason in Uziel, often gives more midrashic translations. It's not the Targum Onkelos that we're more familiar with, is to some degree a more literal translation of the Torah. Targum Yonason is a more midrashic reading. It says, V'yat nafshasa digayu b'choron, the souls which they, in Aramaic, the souls which they converted, that they created as geirim in Choron. So it's using, again, the halachic language of gerus, of conversion, as if there's a sort of formal gerus process. The concept of gerus, of becoming a ger, a convert to Judaism, it applies at the time. Again, presumably this doesn't mean literally in the halachic or technical sense that there was a Jewish people to join, that they somehow in the process of gerus became literally a member of Avram's family. Presumably means they adopted the tenets of the belief that Avram was teaching of belief in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, monotheism, belief in Hashem. There's other times, by the way, that we find Chazal using language of gerus. They talk about Basya, the daughter of Paro, also as being an Niskaya. Why did she go down to the river to bathe? So one midrashic answer is she did so in order to dip in the mikveh. The river is in this context, a kosher mikveh, and she dips in it in order to become a giores, a convert. So again, these also I don't think are clear cut to suggest that they literally mean a halachic status of gerus. So what can we say about this, and how will we go about trying to answer this question? And as I said, part of the problem is we're not really clear what the question means. We're asking whether Avos gerim, but probably more accurately, what we would need to ask is, what do we mean by the concept of gerus at all? I'll just post again the link because I see a few people have joined both of the links. For those that don't have the link, and again, we'll do the normal format of if anyone wishes to ask questions, please do so either live or unmuting yourself, or by using the chat function, or here live in the shul. So I think one way to answer this question of what we mean by you know, I have to ask some things that people realize there is someone here. So what do we mean by the concept of the Jewish identity? So I think one way to answer this is by looking at the concept of a covenant, which we began discussing last week, and questions that were asked me about it were the immediate trigger to giving the shiur this week. And I printed at the bottom of page 1 a covenantal timeline, a little box in which I list the covenants that we find in the Torah. I mentioned last week that the concept of covenants, often very rarely discussed really, is really throughout the Torah, again and again appears. And I've put next to each covenant where I've printed the source for that covenant in the handout sheets. And some of them will be very familiar to you and obvious, others of them are less familiar. The first covenant I put in our list is the bris, the covenant of Adam, which if you're familiar with your written Torah, your Torah Shemichsav, you'll say, where do we find the bris? Where do we find the covenant with Adam at all? And we will look at that in source 8. Then there's the covenant of Noach, which we are familiar with. Hashem made a bris, the covenant with Noach after the Teva. There's a bris made with Avram, the bris bein habasorim, very mysterious and mystical episode that we will have a look at also if we have time, in which Avram cuts, it's called bein habasorim, the bris of the covenant of the parts, because he cuts and distributes parts of animals on either side, and then he goes through this covenant, and then he has this very deep dream in which he's told the prophecy, of a dark prophecy of Gei Zaracha, your descendants will be strangers in a strange land, the prediction of the exile and so on. And then there's the most famous covenant perhaps of all, the bris milah, the covenant of circumcision, which Avram undergoes. And then we move on a national level, the Sinai Covenant in after the Exodus from Egypt, the renewal of the covenant after the golden calf, and then in the final year of the desert, there's the covenant of the plains of Moab, the Techach of Kisavo, and the covenant of Nitzavim, which is a second covenant that takes place in the final waning months of Moshe's leadership, as they are standing in the desert, about on the cusp of entering Eretz Yisrael. What's unique about this covenant is the concept of arvut, of mutual responsibility. So Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Lezeh, the idea that we have responsibility for other people's behavior, is the covenant of Nitzavim, the bris of Arvus. So these are the various covenants that appear. What is the concept of covenantness, of covenant, the concept of a bris, a covenant? So I explored this last week, so I'm not going to mention this again very briefly. The root of the word covenant, by the way, in English, it's linked to many other English words from a Latin word, which has the N and the V rotating in both forms. Basically, like convene, to come together. It's coming together. That's really what a covenant is. It's coming togetherness. It's a binding agreement in which both sides recognise that they share aims that neither side can do by themselves, and together they can achieve something. So it's a shared goal which together we can achieve. It's not a partnership in which there's a sort of quid pro quo in which there's a very calculated mechanism of you contribute this much and I contribute that much, and effectively it's almost an exchange of goods. It's a relationship. It's an understanding that we do each need to contribute because together we can do things that separately we can't, but we each contribute in our own way. It's not necessarily a relationship of equals. And in fact, obviously the covenants in the Torah are not a relationship of equals. It's extraordinary. It's a covenant between the infinite HaKadosh Baruch Hu and us mere mortals. And part of the chiddush, part of the innovation and insight of the covenant is that we can make a covenant with the all-powerful infinite absolute, with God himself, with HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. And the reason we can make a covenant is because he has a plan for existence, for us. HaKadosh Baruch Hu can and do everything, but he has chosen to give to us free will and for us to make something of this world which we've been given and to make something of ourselves. And in that sense, he needs us because he has chosen to give autonomy to us, and we can perfect ourselves and perfect this world. And therefore we work in a partnership with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in covenant with him, in order to achieve that aim. I also mentioned, and I just reprinted these sources, the Ibn Ezra, who derives the etymology of the word bris from similar to the word borah, to choose, or baru, to clarify. He says a bris is fundamentally a choice, which is entered into. It's a chosenness, it's a clarification. I enter into a covenant with you, but I don't enter into a covenant with you. All covenants mean choice. I'm choosing what our shared goals are and who I'm going to work with. If I'm in a covenant with everyone and everything, then I'm in a covenant with no one. Part of the covenant is a uniqueness associated with it. And we saw the Ramban, who brings from the Kabbalistic sources, who say that bris is derived from the word bria, or briat, creation of. A bris creates a new entity. It's being born again. It's a submersion of identity into a bris. You can be in a partnership with someone, a business, a commercial, contractual relationship with someone without submerging your identity. On the contrary, I have my identity, you have your identity, and we're in a partnership together. But a bris is more fundamental than that. It's shared goals, it's shared aspirations, it's a genuine relationship and working together. And therefore, there's a loss or a recreation of identity that emerges from the concept of a bris. This is what comes out from understanding, from looking at the sources around what a bris means. Now, if we look at a couple of examples of covenants, we see this very clearly. So we'll have a look at source 5, which is the bris milah. Note and I'll just whiz through this. Note in Pasuk 2 that it's two-way. Every covenant has this. I'll set my covenant between me and you. A covenant, by definition, has to be two-way. In Pasuk 3, Avram falls on his face. We'll get back to that and Rashi's comment on that. In Pasuk 5, you see the idea of a new identity. You shall no longer be called Avram, but your name shall be Avraham. Now, not every bris involves a renaming, but bris can involve a renaming and often does. And this is an example of it, in which when Avram enters into the covenant, he gets a new name. Why do you get a new name when you enter into the covenant? Because it's not just a technical partnership, it's a reforming of identity, and therefore it makes sense to get a new name, and therefore that's when we give to this day a new name to a child. In Pasuk Zayin, again, you see that the bris is two-way. It's two-way, and each side makes a commitment in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I will be to you as a God, which means you have the responsibilities of me being your God, and I in turn have the responsibilities of being God for you. So in Pasuk Zayin, Hashem says, I will be for you as a God. And in Pasuk 9, Hashem says to Avram, and you have responsibilities. V'ato es brisi tishma. You have the responsibility of keeping my covenant. So you have responsibilities. And in Pasuk 15, we see, of course, that part of this covenant isn't just a renaming of Avram to Avram, but also the renaming of Sarai, who becomes Sarah. That's Pasuk 15. Incidentally, there is a piece from the Brisk Rav, the Rav of Brisk, in which he discusses why Avram waited till he was given the mitzvah of Bris Milah before fulfilling it. If the source in Kedushin that we began the show with, the Mishnah tells us that Avram fulfilled all the mitzvahs before they were given, why had he not already done Bris Milah? Why did he wait for an instruction to do it? And his answer to the question really ties into what we're discussing. He says you can keep any mitzvah you wish, but you can't unilaterally enter into a covenant. A covenant has to be, by definition, two-way. That's the whole point of a covenant. So Avram can keep tefillin and shofar and sharpness and certainly Ben Adam Chavera, Hafnas Tzorchim and Tzedakah. He can't enter into the bris milah without being commanded to do so, because the whole point of the bris is it's a covenant. You can't enter into a covenant unilaterally. The whole point is it's a covenantal relationship. So therefore, this is an example he gives of this is an idea expressed that really ties into what we're speaking about. So far what we've said is that covenant is close, it's a positive relationship, it makes us into a team. But also the picture of a covenant turns a little darker. There's a very different type of covenant, which, and here I printed one example of this, it's the covenant of the plains of Moab in source 6, which is the Toldot covenant. And if you read the covenant, it's truly awful, right? We're familiar with the text of the Toldot pasuk. This is in source 6, I think, at the top of page 3. The covenant of the plains of Moab. If you don't listen to my voice, if you listen to my voice, all the blessings will come upon you. If you don't listen to my voice, pasuk 15, then all the curses will come upon you. And I just cut and pasted here some examples. You shall become an astonishment, a proverb, a byword of what will happen. You'll be scattered amongst all people from one end of the earth to the other. Pasuk samach vav, your life shall hang in doubt before you. You will fear, you'll be in fear day and night, you'll have no assurance of life. These are the words of the covenant. Elu divrei habris. These are the words of covenant. Milvat habris asher karasit on Chorev. Besides the bris that took place in Chorev, so concludes pasuk 69, the final words of this covenant. In other words, what this pasuk is saying is there's a bris, there's a covenant that took place at Har Sinai, the covenant of the giving of the Torah. But part of this covenant, or an additional layer to this covenant, is a penalties clause. If you enter into a bris, then it's possible for that to have awful consequences also. And this is another part of the response to a bris, meaning bria, creation. If you've indeed been recreated, then we understand why rupturing that is a painful thing. A partnership can be broken up, a contractual partnership can be broken up. A bris, a covenant, a reformation of identity isn't something that can be broken up pain-free. If you wish to render yourself asunder, it's not just a separation of two independent entities. Formerly, maybe they were independent entities, but now that you've entered into a covenant, they've merged into one, and therefore this is a surgical procedure that's taking place. There's an operation taking place. There's a rupturing of an identity that's taking place. There's always pain that's involved in an amputation that's occurring, because this is something a new sort of relationship that's entered into. A partnership you can break up pain-free. A marriage, a bris, a covenant is by definition painful if it begins separating. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, you've entered into the covenant. What is the covenant? That I'm using you as the people who demonstrate to humans Hashem's interest in human achievement, and his interest in human achievement, and therefore there's a price to pay if you rupture this covenant. If you break this covenant, it's not going to be pain-free. There's going to be a consequence to it. In other words, when you as soon as a covenant is in place, there's something you need to live up to. And pre the covenant, you could have been absolutely fine. You could have been okay. You could have been a functioning person. But now that you've entered into the covenant, if you're not up to standards, then already there's a price to pay. If we turn back to source 5, there's a Rashi that sort of points this out. And this is Rashi on pasuk 3. So in source 5 on page 2, which is the giving of the covenant of the bris milah, the pasuk says that when Avram received his prophecy, Vayipol Avram al ponov, Avram fell on his face, and Hashem spoke to him saying. So Rashi said, why does Avram fall on his face? Answers Rashi, because of fear of the divine presence. Till he was circumcised, he didn't have ability to stand, and the divine spirit is standing over him. In other words, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu is appearing in front of Avram, when the divine presence spirit is standing over Avram, he falls to his face. He's unable to stand in the experience of prophecy because he's not yet circumcised. He's an oral, he's uncircumcised. He can't stand in front of Hashem. Now the question is, why are we only told about him falling in this prophecy? I mean, this is the bris ben Absarim. Avram's had many other, this is the bris milah, the covenant of circumcision. Avram's had many other revelations in which Hashem appeared to him. I mean, starting right from the beginning of the Sedra, we're not told in any other time that Avram falls on his face because he is uncircumcised and therefore is unable to stand when the bris happens till he becomes circumcised, when the nevuah and the prophecy happens. So why is it that he falls on this occasion and no other? And the answer to the question is exactly what we're speaking about. Till the mitzvah of bris milah is given, Avram isn't lacking anything. The covenant hasn't yet been created, as we said from the bris Garav. Avram can't unilaterally enter into this mitzvah because it's a two-way relationship. It's a bris. So Avram's not lacking everything by being an oral. There isn't a concept of an oral, of being uncircumcised, because there's no flaw in that. There's no pagam in that. There's no limitation in that. There is no covenant yet for him to enter into. Here is the prophecy, the revelation in which the bris is going to be entered. Here is the point in which this concept is being formed. Now Avram is lacking something because he hasn't yet fulfilled the mitzvah, and therefore he falls on his face. Pre the creation of his covenant, Avram's lacking nothing. He's not an uncovenantal being. His covenant isn't yet in existence. He may have other covenants with Hashem. Depending on how you date the timing, he's presumably had the covenant of the bris ben Absarim. He's had the covenant of the parts. He's had other covenants with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But this covenant hasn't yet been created, so he's not lacking anything in his relationship with Hashem. Now that a more powerful covenant, a fuller covenant has been created, the most powerful covenant that Avram at least ever enters into, the bris milah, this covenant is such a powerful, important covenant, it's so essential to his spiritual being, that while he is uncovenanted, while he isn't in the bris, he falls on his face and isn't able to stand in the presence of the divine. Till now, he never fell on his face for not being circumcised, because the concept of the bris, the covenant of circumcision, doesn't exist. Now that it's been created through this very prophecy that he is now experiencing, he now is non-covenanted to this level, and therefore he falls to the ground. What this is showing is that pre the existence of a bris, you can be perfectly fine by yourself. But now that it exists, opting out isn't always an option. You'll be lacking something by not entering into that relationship. And if you do opt in, then trying to rupture the relationship of the psukim we just read in the tochacha, in the rebuke, can be an exceptionally painful experience. So pre-bris, Avram lacks nothing. Now that Hashem is creating the covenant with him, if he's not in it, he's out of it, he's lacking something. And once he's in it, or once his descendants are in it, they've received the bris, the covenant of Chorev of Sinai. If they wish to opt out, tochacha, they're rupturing, they're rendering themselves into pieces, and therefore they're going to suffer for attempting to do so. Why? Because a bris is, as we said from the Ramban, is a bria, is a creation of something, and they're trying to rupture that creation. Okay, so this is these are samples of some of the concepts of bris, and we're beginning now perhaps to feel our way towards what maybe it means to be Jewish. We asked the question, were the Avos Jewish? And we then reflected that we didn't really know what the word Jewish meant. We're not even sure what the question means. It would appear that to be Jewish means to have a connection, to be a covenantal partner with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But let's try and step back a bit and contextualize this more fully. Here I want to turn in source 7 to the first pasuk in the Torah, something we've looked at before, hopefully many times, and even in the context of the shiur, we've looked at this, and the grammatical problem with the first pasuk of the Torah. And the pasuk says, "Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim es haaretz," always translated as "in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And Rashi points out that this is a grammatical problem. It doesn't say "in the beginning, God created." Rashi understands the word "bereshis," normally speaking, would mean "in the beginning of." It's a bit like what's the name of the grammatical form when you have something attached at the beginning of it? Construct. Thank you. Construct. So it's a construct form. You have the word simcha is happiness. Simchas is simchat Torah. Simchas Torah, the happiness of the Torah. So Bereshis is possibly a construct form, in the beginning of. So Rashi is bothered by this translation, and there's many answers to this question. But one answer Rashi gives is a midrashic, or perhaps Rashi says this in the Pshat in the pasuk, reading of the pasuk. Bereshis doesn't mean in the beginning God created heaven and earth, but for the sake of beginningness, he created the heavens and the earth. It's telling us the reason for creation. Bereshis, with or for the sake of Reshis, that which starts, Reshit, that which is the beginning, Hashem created the heaven and the earth. and for the creation of that which is primary, that starts things off. Who is it that starts things off? Yisrael, the Jewish people. So here Rashi is saying that one translation of the pasuk is, for the sake of that which is primary, that which starts things off, for the sake of Yisrael, the Jewish people, the world was created. Now, how are we meant to make sense of that? What does that mean? And indeed, is the whole world just created for Yisrael, for the Jewish people? What's about the rest of humanity? What's their role in this? What's their purpose in creation? And the answer to the question is that as yet, the title Yisrael is open. It's not yet been adopted by any particular family. In fact, we know when the title Yisrael was attached to a particular human being, and this is when Yaakov is given the additional name and additional title Yisrael. Note, by the way, that Yaakov doesn't lose his name Yaakov. When Avram is renamed Avram, when Sarai is renamed Sarah, they lose their previous name. This is a personal renaming. When Yaakov is renamed Israel, he doesn't lose his name Yaakov, he's still referred to as Yaakov. He achieves the title Israel. So the title Israel, which was there for the taking, has now formed or crystallized or concretized in the person of Yaakov. And ever since then, for the Klal Yisrael, who adopt as a group, as a family, as a nation, the title of Yisrael. In other words, this title is open potentially for all humanity, and a particular branch of humanity adopt this title. This is expressed in midrashic form in a number of ways. It's expressed famously in the Medrash that talks about the giving of the Torah, that the giving of the Torah itself, the bris of Chorev, the bris of Sinai, which we saw mentioned earlier, was a bris that we entered into, but initially the plan was to offer it to anyone to enter into. This is the Medrash that Hashem went around the world and offered the Torah to Hafiyah Ma'aparan, Vasa Ruvez Kodesh, etc. The opening psukim of the Zos HaBracha. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to go to Seir, he wanted to go to Paran, he wanted to go to the nations of the world to offer them the covenants. The covenant of Chorev was also a covenant that was open to everyone. To put this more fully, all humanity was really meant to be in a covenantal relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And in fact, Chazal say it more fully than that. They say humanity was born into a covenantal relationship. So as in the world within which we currently live, we are born into the covenant of Yisrael. All Jews are born into the covenant of Yisrael. Someone asked me after my shiur last week, if a covenant is meant to be freely entered into, what's the concept of a Jew being born into a covenant? None of us chose to enter into the covenant at Har Sinai. And the answer to the question is, it was a corporate entering into the covenant. We entered into the covenant as a people, as a nation, with a corporate identity. And therefore, anyone who belongs to that corporate identity has entered into the covenant. And we'll revisit this in a few moments in a little greater depth. All humans initially were meant to be born into a covenant. And this is expressed by Chazal in a Gemara in Sanhedrin, which I printed in source 8. And the Gemara in Sanhedrin says that Rav Nachman says, Adam Arishon Kofa Be'ikah. Adam was a heretic. That means to say he breached ranks. He broke ranks with the Jewish people, with something he was meant to be part of. Where do we find Adam breaks ranks? The answer is because the pasuk says, "V'hema ka'Adam." They are like Adam. It's talking about people who are like Adam. They're Adam-like in what way? Ovru bris, because they annulled the covenant. Because if Adam is brisi heifa, he annulled my covenant. So the Gemara here is saying Adam had a covenant with Hashem, and he breached that covenant, and that's what we call a kofa bika. That's the concept of a heretic in this understanding of Chazal, someone who's in breach of covenant. So Adam was in covenant with Hashem, which he broke. Where does Adam enter into covenant with Hashem? We don't find anywhere that he enters into covenant with Hashem. I mentioned when we looked at the timeline of covenants in source at the bottom of page 1, I mentioned the other covenants we know. We know where the bris Noach happens. We know where Noach entered into a covenant with Hashem. But where did Adam enter a covenant with Hashem? And the answer is nowhere. We don't find it anywhere. But we have a medrash. And this is a medrash in Avos Rabbi Nosson. We're familiar with Pirkei Avos, which is a mishnayos of sayings of the sages, ethics of the fathers. There's a brisa, a less edited collection of midrashic statements referred to as Avos Rabbi Nosson, the compilation of Rabbi Nosson of sages of the sages, the sayings of the sages. And there in Avos Rabbi Nosson, in chapter 2, Mishnah 5, printed at the bottom of page 3, he says, Af Adam Rishon Yotzamahul. Adam Rishon was born circumcised. Adam, God created man in his image. So what this medrash is saying is that Adam is born into the bris, not just any old bris, but actually the highest bris that Avraham achieves in his life, which is the bris milah, the covenant of the circumcision. So Adam is born mahul, he's born circumcised, he's born, again, figuratively, literally, biologically, in every level, but for the point of what we're looking at is, he's born into the covenant, he's born into the bris, which Avraham, by sweat and toil, after many nisyonos and challenges, eventually rebuilds that relationship with Hashem, the bris milah. Adam is born into it. But what are Chazal telling us over here? What does this mean to say he's born into a covenant? The answer to the question is, we said every covenant is a relationship, a sense of identity. It's a shared goal, it's a shared mission. The Ramban tells us from the Mekubalim that the meaning of the word covenant is brias, a creation of it, it's a creation of a new identity. All covenants are a pale copy of what? Of creation. Adam is literally created by Hashem. He's literally a tzir kapov. He's literally imbued and endowed with Tzelem Elokim, with the image of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and through that comes into the fullness of what we mean to be a human being. Every other bris that takes place is a pale copy of that. Avraham, through a lot of toil, manages to recreate himself, enter into a recreation, bria, bris, with Hashem. He's recreated by HaKadosh Baruch Hu and given a new name to symbolize that, and so on and so forth. The rest of human history is clawing our way back. We enter into the bris at Har Sinai, we enter into the bris of Avos Moab, all the covenants that we enter into, they're clawing our way back to achieve that which Adam is born into. Because Adam is literally brias, the creation of Hashem. He's literally born mahul, he's born in the Tzelem Elokim. All the rest of us have to spend our lives hoping, if we do a little bit of what we're meant to, that we achieve some semblance of godliness about ourselves. But Adam Rishon is born godly, so he's born into the bris. So this gives us a fuller understanding of what we mean when we say the world is created for Yisrael. In essence, if we ask ourselves, is Adam Yisrael? Is Adam Rishon Yisrael? Well, if Yisrael means a ben beris, a covenantal partner with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in essence, he's born into that. All of humanity should have had these covenants. Adam disregarded the covenant. All of humanity is offered later chances to enter into the covenant. A covenant is begun with Noach, a very low-level covenant, the covenant of B'nai Noach. Every human still has some low-level covenantal relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's a quid pro quo, a team spirit, a partnership that exists between all humans and HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Hashem, of course. But the fullness of the covenant is something that's only achieved later, till eventually it reaches a tipping point and there's a strong enough covenant that's entered into, that is Yisrael. So if we ask ourselves, what does Rashi mean when he says the world is created for Yisrael? He means rashis, that which comes first, that which is the trigger that creates that which humans are meant to be. Humans who are b'nei bris, who are covenantal partners with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Initially, Adam is meant to be that, and then later, all humans are meant to be that. Adam opts out of it, and slowly over a process of time, Noach, then Avraham, then the giving of the Torah, there's a group of human beings who re-achieve the status and the title of Yisrael because they've again entered into a covenantal relationship with Hashem. This seems to be the pattern of what we're saying. So if we now revisit our initial question, what is it to be a Jew? The answer is to be a covenantal partner, to be a ben bris with Hashem. But now we need to ask ourselves, which bris? There's been a whole sequence of brises that we outlined in source 3. Which bris is the critical one which crosses over the threshold and makes one into Yisrael? Noach has a bris with Hashem, but his descendants are B'nai Noach. They're not members of Yisrael. They have a level of covenantal relationship, but not the critical mass. Avraham has more of a relationship. He has the bris ben Absorim, then he has bris milah. Eventually, the Jewish people are given the Torah. They have the bris of Har Chorev, the Sinai bris. They have the bris of Avos Moab, the plains of Moab. They have the bris of Nitzavim, which is Arvus and mutual responsibility. At which point is the name Yisrael achieved? So here we have which one is the critical mass? Which one is enough of the covenantal relationship? At which point are we bound up closely enough with Hashem that we have this identity of Yisrael, which is B'shvil Yisrael, for the sake of Yisrael, that the world is created. We can say this is a human being who has adopted the title Yisrael. And here we have a very important and also frustratingly unclear Ramban. And this I think I printed in source 9 on page 4, and I put it in a grey box to signify its importance. The Ramban is in the context of discussing the story of the blasphemer and the identity of this blasphemer, what his identity is. And he says, my view is not like the previously mentioned opinion. And now the crucial words, I think I underlined them. At the point when Avram entered into the covenant, Yisrael, at that point they became Yisrael. That Yisrael came into existence, had been crystallized and concretized onto a human being. And no longer will they be counted amongst the nations of the world. Or as they say, Esav Yisrael Meshumatu. We'll get back to that source later. Esav is described as Yisrael Meshumad, as an assimilated Yisrael. And as even Esav has a shame Yisrael. He has the title or name or status of Yisrael. But he is Yisrael who's lost that, who's Meshumad, who has annihilated and assimilated his identity, but fundamentally could have and should have and was born into being a member of Yisrael. So the Ramban tells us that in his view, Avram already has the shame Yisrael, already is a Jew, he's already Israel, when he achieved the bris. But now we ask ourselves the question, which bris? Does this mean the bris bein habasarim, the covenant of the parts, or does this mean the bris milah, the covenant of circumcision? Well, in the Ramban, the way it's printed in front of us, it isn't clear. If you look at the scientific editions of the Ramban, where they check manuscripts, unfortunately, there are two gesaros, there are two texts in the Ramban in the manuscripts. In one of them, he says bris milah, another one he says bris bein habasarim. So frustratingly, we are left unclear as to which covenant is the critical covenant which determines the status of Israel. So we know that Avram achieved at some point a close enough covenantal relationship with Hashem to have the title Yisrael, but which covenant is the critical mass of bris, we're not clear in the Ramban. Now, why would these two covenants be the critical ones? What's unique about these covenants that makes Israel? So if our journey is correct, and we are now we've become aware that the idea of Jewishness, of Israel, means a covenantal partnership, and a certain critical threshold, the critical mass is crossed when that's close enough that this is Israel. It's not just a general partnership like Bnei Noach, but it's a particularist one like Israel. And that's what achieves the status. What is the crucial feature of that bris that makes it Israel? So we're now hopefully plumbing to the depth of what we mean when we talk about Jewish identity, covenantal partnership, a certain depth of relationship with Hashem. But what is it that's unique about these covenants that makes this cross the threshold and make it Israel? So it'd be nice if we knew which one was the critical bris, but we can look at both these covenants and try and draw out certain unique features of what makes this covenant into an important covenant. In the bris bein habasarim, in the bris of the covenant, we see various features which begin sounding like Klal Yisrael. We see in Pasuk, and I printed this in source 10, I've printed some of the lines, we see that in Pasuk 12, Vayhi Hashem Eshlove, the sun is going down. The deep sleep falls on Avram. V'nei ema chashecha gedola nefeles olav. The dreads of great darkness fell upon him. In other words, this is the bris in which there's a price to pay. There's a difficulty around this bris. This is a scary and frightening and, dark commitment in this bris. This is in fact the first covenant where we find explicit a price to be paid if you in accepting this covenant. This is in a sense the source of the tochacha. So the tochacha, the rebuke that we looked at that takes place on a national level in Sefer Devarim, in which we see there's horrible consequences to breaking the bris. Here in the bris made with Avram, on a personal level, there's already consequences. So maybe this is the unique feature. A covenant with HaKadosh Baruch Hu that's close enough to give them Shem Yisrael has to have a price to it, has to have consequences. In fact, the bris bein habasarim is described as one of the Asor Nisyonos, one of the 10 tests that Avram went through. That means to say it was difficult for him to accept this covenant. When we read the Torah, we don't appreciate that. We just read the Torah, and Hashem appears to Avram, and Avram accepts his covenant, he's given the covenant, and he accepts it. But if Chazal are telling us it's one of the 10 Nisyonos, it means it's a struggle. He finds it hard to accept this covenant. There's a struggle to accept it. There's a trial in it, because Avram realizes that at this point there's something critical happening and unique. It's a one-way street. It's a point of no return in his relationship with Hashem. This is perhaps one feature that's unique around this covenant. A second feature that's perhaps unique around this covenant is it's not with an individual, it's also with his descendants. So we're getting this corporate identity that we spoke about before. How can an individual take his descendants into the covenant? Because that's part of my identity. I'm part of a whole. It's a family relationship. So this is perhaps the second thing that makes it Yisrael, makes it unique. Hashem can form covenants with individuals. That's great. But individuals exist on planet Earth for a finite amount of time and then they pass. To achieve the title of Yisrael, there has to be an eternity to the covenant. An eternity to the covenant can only be achieved through being part of a greater whole, through being part of Klal Yisrael. And therefore, this is the second unique element of this bris, that it's a bris that's a covenant also with Avram's descendants. In fact, descendants litters the next few Pasukim, Pasuk Yud Gimel, Pasuk Tesvot, Tezayin, Pasuk Yud Ches. Hashem says this is your descendants, Kigei Zaracha, the famous Pasukim from the Haggadah. Your descendants will be strangers in a strange land and who will be persecuted. Pasuk 16, your descendants, the Doravi, will return to Eretz Yisrael, will return here. Pasuk 18, to your offspring, to your descendants, I will give Eretz Yisrael. So the covenant can't be with an individual, it has to be with an entity. The entity that enters into the covenant in Har Sinai, in Chorev, is a nation. The entity that enters into the covenant in the Bris Bein HaBasarim is a family, a one man with a family. However, in both cases, there has to be a continuity to it. It has to be part of an entity which is entering into the covenant. This seems to be a second feature of what makes a covenant unique. Indeed, this is the source of, and the Ramban already references this, of the inability to lose the Shem Yisrael. So what is it that means that once someone is a Jew, they're a Jew forever, and they can't opt out? Because of the covenants that we enter into. Which covenant? According to the Ramban, one of the two covenants that Avraham entered into. And here we have in source 11, I printed the Pasuk in Yeshua, in which the Pasuk says, Chata Yisrael, Yisrael has sinned, the Gam Ovris Brisi, and they even transgressed my covenant, Asher Tivisos, on which I commanded them. And Chazal or Medayik, they notice a nuance in the Pasuk, in which it says we're talking here about a people that have sinned, and they've even transgressed, they've broken the covenant, Ovris Brisi, they've broken the covenant. Nonetheless, what are they called? Yisrael. They're still referred to as Yisrael. So it says the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Chata Yisrael, Omer of Abba Bazavda, Afal Pisha Chata Yisrael hu. Even though they've sinned, they still have the title, the Shem Yisrael. So this is the source of the idea that once Yisrael, you're always Yisrael. This covenant is irrevocable, it's irreversible. Even if you're over, even if you transgress the covenant, there'll be painful consequences. The deep darkness that Aram saw, the terrible punishments of the Techacha, but Yisrael, Afal Pisha Chata Yisrael hu. And the Ramban sort of mirrors this language by saying, when I quoted the Ramban in source 9, he says even Esau, since he's born as a descendant of Avram post one of his covenants, he's Yisrael Meshumot. There's something about the nature of Yisrael that even is imbued in him because it's something that's taken with the descendants. But by the way, this is critical. I mentioned right at the beginning of the shiur the Nefesh Asher Osu B'Choron, which Chazal translate, the Targum Yonason translate as the souls which were made in Choron, meaning the Geirus process. What happened to these souls? Where did they go? What was their history? So we don't really know. But what we do know is they disappeared. Meaning to say that either they or their descendants didn't stay loyal to the relationship with Hashem that Avraham had taught them, and therefore they disappeared. In other words, this is the point, because at that stage Avraham isn't yet in the bris. There is no covenant that they enter into. So what are they? They're fantastic people, they're holy people, they're good people, like Noah, like Shem, like Ava, like all the other great people in our history. These are in the world's history. These are great people, these are spiritual people, they have a relationship with Hashem. But because they don't enter into a bris, because they don't enter into a covenant, and more particularly, they don't enter into an irrevocable covenant, they disappear. And therefore they never form the body of Klal Yisrael. This bris or one of these brises that's being entered into by Avram is a no opt-out bris. It's irrevocable, it's with the people, it's with the family, and therefore it's eternal. So we're now closer to answering our question. If we ask what does it mean to be Israel, we've answered that question. It seems to be a ben bris, to be a covenantal partner with Hashem. How deep does the covenant have to be? We don't know exactly. But at some point, a covenant becomes deep enough that it's no longer just a covenant. It's a redefinition of identity, and we now have the achievement of Yisrael. And at our best, we fulfill the purpose of creation. At what point does the critical mass of bris achieved? The Ramban at least says it's achieved by Avraham already in his lifetime at one of the covenants into which he enters. Which covenant? We don't know exactly. One of the two. what are the unique features that make this covenant important to make Yisrael? We can suggest, we can look at the nature of these covenants and we can try and pull out of them some of the unique features that make them important. The fact that there's a penalty to pay, the fact that they're irrevocable, the fact that they include descendants, and therefore Yisrael, Shechata Yisrael, who, even if one tries to opt out of this, one nonetheless keeps the title of Yisrael. These seem to be the crucial features that make this move from being a mere covenant to be a covenant that forms us into Klal Yisrael. What's interesting here, however, and this is a critical point, and with this I will finish, is that this was enough to give Avram the title of Yisrael, but it's not enough to give us the title of Yisrael. And this again brings up what I mentioned before, that when there's an absence of a relationship with Hashem, until that model is created, there's no lack in that. But once it's put in place, there's a lack in not achieving it. I remember Avram falling on his face. Every time Avram gets prophecy pre the circumcision covenant, the fact he's uncircumcised doesn't diminish his spiritual stature, his ability to connect to Hashem. He doesn't fall on his face when he gets a prophecy. Now that the circumcision covenant is brought into the world, until he adopts it, until he takes it on board, he falls on his face. He's diminished. As soon as there's a higher level of connection available, merely having the lower level isn't enough. So Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov can be Yisrael with the number of covenants they have. But us going forward, if we only have their covenants and we don't have the further covenants, we're not Yisrael. So someone who is part of Bris Avram, he's in the covenantal relationship of Avram. In the time of Avram is enough. Avram is Yisrael. And our time isn't enough because there's other brisim we need to enter into, other covenants. What other the brisim take place? The bris of HaChorev, the bris of Matan Torah, the bris of Sinai. Avram can be Yisrael without that bris, but now that there's the later bris, we're not Yisrael without that bris. If all we have is a bris milah, that's not what it means to be a Jew. There has to be other things also. And this is specified in Halacha. I printed in source 12. The Ramban wrote in the Rambam in his Hilchas Geirus, which appears for reasons I'm not going to go into now in the laws of forbidden marriage. He says, Yisrael entered into the Sinai Covenant with three things: B'milah, with the circumcision covenant, that's from Avram, Tevilah, and Carbon. The Chayin he says at the end, after he defines one, Milah in Mitzrayim, circumcision in Egypt, immersion, Tevilah in the mikveh in the wilderness, sacrifice at that time. And he says similarly throughout the generations, the Chayin when a Gentile wants to enter into the covenant, it is Tofi Tachas Kamfei Ashkenah, and be sheltered under the divine presence, the Kabbalah of Old Torah, and accept upon himself the yoke of Torah, Tevilah, Carbon, etc. So post Matan Torah, the only way to enter into the status of Israel is by undergoing a repetition of the Sinai Covenant. Yisrael entered into the Sinai Covenant with Bris Milah, with immersion, and with a carbon, a sacrifice, and acceptance of mitzvahs. In future times, also someone can only enter into the covenantal relationship of Matan Torah with that. There isn't a middle option. You can't go back to being an Avram, a covenantal partner of Hashem. You can't be a member of a faith, an Abrahamic faith, and have the title of Israel, even if one has genuine and sincerely entered into Bris Avram, because post Matan Torah, there's a Bris HaChorev, there's the Bris of Sinai, which is the critical feature of entering into Matan Torah, entering into Jewish status. What's interesting is that there's then further brisim that are achieved. There's the bris of Avos Moab, which is the Toldot, which we already mentioned, the rebuke, the punishment, consequences. And then there's the bris of Arvus, of mutual responsibility. So Kol Yisrael, this is the covenant made in itself, and we're all responsible for each other. That means if I've done my mitzvah, but you haven't done your mitzvah, I haven't yet fully fulfilled my mitzvah. This has halachic ramifications. I can be motzi you in a mitzvah. Yotza motzi, even though I've already done the mitzvah, I've already blown shofar. How can I blow shofar for you and that you fulfill your mitzvah of Tkiyas shofar? The answer is because till you fulfilled your mitzvah, I'm still a bar chiyuv, I'm still obligated to the mitzvah. I haven't yet fulfilled my mitzvah of Tkiyas shofar. So there's the concept of arvus, there's a deepening of that connection. Post Matan Torah, Klal Yisrael are certainly Jews. They're referred to again and again as Bnei Yisrael. But interestingly, they're still going through their incubation period of the 40 years in the desert. Post Matan Torah, it's enough to be a Jew, to be in the covenants of Sinai. But once you've gone through the plains of Moab, and the final year in the desert, and the final swan song speech of Moshe, and there's been another two covenants that have been created, the Tochacha, the rebuke of the plains of Moab, and the Arvus, the mutual responsibility covenant of Nitzavim, one can only be a Jew if one's also part of those covenants. So even though Klal Yisrael are already Yisrael after Matan Torah, as extra covenants are added, they mature in that relationship, and they only have that status and that achievement and that name, and that's if they now have all three covenants. So what we're seeing here is a progression. For Avram Avinu, it's enough for him to be Yisrael when he's had either one or two of the covenants of the parts and the covenants of the Bris Milah. For the Jewish people, there's another layer that's added. They become Israel when they've had Matan Torah. Once that covenant's created, there's not enough just to have the Abrahamic covenants. They also need the Sinai Covenant. And after that, they also need the covenants of the plains of Moab and the covenants of Aravus, of mutual responsibility to be a Jew. So the name of Israel is ever deepened through these covenantal relationships, through the connection that's made. By the way, this is also reflected in the halachic system, the idea that Gerish and Iskayuk, a convert to converts, has a halachic status of being like a child who's reborn. So again, because in entering the covenant, there's a new status that's adopted, this has ramifications in halacha, so that at least as far as Torah law is concerned, a ger can marry a close relative, and this is considered the adoption of a new identity. So we began by asking a question, what is were the Ovis a Jew? We moved to question what we actually mean by being a Jew. Hopefully we've given some insight into what we mean by that. It means to be a covenantal partner with Hashem, to be in a covenant with Hashem. We've seen how this covenants deepen, ever deepen, until some point the name Yisrael is adopted. Even after the name Yisrael is adopted, the covenantal relationship deepens further. And all these, if one enters into all these covenants at that point, one can say one's Yisrael. And finally, where we began, was seen that unfortunately and sadly, part of this identity covenant is sometimes there's a price to pay, sometimes it's difficult. The first image of a Jew in the black Obelisk of Charminettes of the second, the tribute given by Yehu, in which he's found groveling and subjugated, unfortunately is also the flip side of what it means to be a Jew, to be a covenantal partner with a price to pay, when, as unfortunately Yehu did, we breach our covenant, our relationship with Hashem. So I'll stop there. I think there's a couple of questions here on the chat function. Okay, someone poses a question about the terminology, Jewish, Ivri, etc. I mean, that's a fair question. I wasn't going into the terminology of this. You're absolutely right. I was just using. I began this year with a confusion, which is what does it mean to be a Jew? Because these things are unclear. I hope by the end I've clarified that there's something called a Yisrael, which Yaakov was given the formal title of, as a halachic status of being a Jew. So thank you for that question, and thank you to all of you who joined live. And thank you to everyone who's joined on Zoom also. I hope next week we'll go back to our more usual format of half an hour Parsha, half an hour Halacha. But for now, I'll bring this to a conclusion and wish you all a good evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful as usual.
Thank you. Sorry?
Thanks, Noah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bring me on Boda. Thank you. Good night.
The two versions in the Ramban. I don't know what to make of this case of confusion. It's I was frustrated. And the Ramban he says when Avram entered into the bris, but when you look in the manuscripts, it's not clear which bris he means. So there's a gesa problem. I don't know. Maybe he changed his mind. Maybe someone filled it in. People guess what he meant. It's not clear. But if you look in the text of the Ramban, it's not clear which bris he means. Yeah.
Does that mean that it was a bris that would be after Shmuel was born?
Yeah, that might suggest that's a good point, because the bris Milo is made after Shmuel was born. So that's a good point. It's a good deal.
Well, right.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. It's not a fine point, right? Because Shmuel is born before the bris Milah, but post the bris Ben Absarim. That would seem to suggest that Yishmael isn't Yisrael Mama. Esav is Yisrael Mama. So it seems to suggest the core covenant in terms of continuity is Yishmael, is the bris Milah. It's not a proof though, because it's possible that the name Yisrael is achieved with the bris ben Absarim, and the descendant, the inability to opt out, is achieved with the bris Milah. Yeah, it could be both. Yeah, maybe.